Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today, I'm talking about album number 8 from The Orb, The Dream. Okay, so, I mentioned in the last video that I did on The Orb, that these guys' albums post-Bicycles and Tricycles would switch off between being much more subtle and stripped back, led by Thomas Fellman, and leaning into the wackier and poppier side of their sound, typically featuring Youth as a key member. And The Dream is very much the epitome of the latter. Fellman is completely absent from this album, and instead the lineup of the band is limited to Patterson, Youth, and Tim Brand from the band Dreadzone. And the result is just the complete opposite of Okie Dokie in terms of its approach. Where that album mostly stayed low-key and simple, The Dream revels in just going totally extra on everything. It's a lot louder and more energetic, way busier mixes with way more going on, filled with tons of vocal samples all over the place in every single moment. And there's also lots of regular sung vocal appearances and catchy pop hooks too. Albums as wildly different in approach as Okie Dokie and The Dream in the same catalog has kind of led to the band's fanbase ending up kinda split up. There are fans who enjoy both sides of the Orb sound, including myself, though it seems more common to come across fans who only like the Fellman stuff or only like the stuff with Youth. And I think even most of the fans like me who say they're a fan of both probably still have a preference towards one or the other. You might find the stuff with Fellman, like Okie Dokie, to be a lot stodgier or maybe more boring. Or you might be a fan of the more subtle charm those albums provide and meanwhile think an album like this is far too cheesy and pop-friendly and goofy for your liking. Now, in one breath, I have admittedly come to understand the other side of the coin more and more as I've heard other people's perspectives, and we've gotten albums like Abolition of the Royal Familia that don't do the cheesier side of the Orb sound as well, and the Fellman albums have grown on me more over time. But, I mean, I've made it no secret that I've always had a stronger preference towards the Orb's zanier material like this. And if you want to directly blame something for albums like Okie Dokie and Baghdad Batteries originally completely falling flat for me when I first heard them, you can absolutely blame The Dream. Because I absolutely adore The Dream to this day. I found it to be an experience that delivers on a level that no other album has ever replicated, and I'll even go as far as to say, on a personal level, I hold this album up almost on par with Adventures Beyond the Ultraworld. I already ranked it as my number 26 favorite album of all time back in 2016, and I still stand by that high placement. I don't think it's better than their debut. I feel like that one's much too toweringly important to beat, and with a much more universal appeal that's easier to recommend to newcomers. Meanwhile, I will perfectly understand if you didn't like this album. I know this album obviously has its fans, but I don't think I've ever come across anyone who holds this particular album to the same astronomical standard that I do. Even I will have to freely admit, like, this album is not the most, like, highbrow or dignified listening experience you're ever gonna come across. There are plenty of lyrics on this thing, both sung and sampled, but you're gonna be disappointed if you go into them looking for any kind of deeper meaning behind any of it. Most of it is just silly and random for its own sake. It reaches a level of goofiness unmatched in the rest of the Orb catalog to date, which should be really saying something given how they've always been pretty dang goofy on a baseline level. And I could easily see people saying that this album basically just doubled down on their least favorite aspects of projects like Cydonia and Bicycles and Tricycles, with all the pop crossover elements that somehow feel even dumber and cheesier than ever before. Now, of course, for me, the sheer unadulterated goofiness of this album is directly part of the appeal. No one but The Orb would attempt a project like this. And all the random vocal samples peeking around every corner and giving this project its weird sense of humor, going over all these dense and heavily grooving dub mixes, it's delivered in such a way where Alex Patterson's presence in particular cannot be ignored. It feels like this is probably the project in the Orb catalog where his contributions are felt the most, probably. Not like in a directorial role, like his actual, like, the sampling and stuff, you know what I mean. And it certainly helps that every single groove is absolutely top-notch, everything hits super hard and sounds really satisfying, the mix balancing is beautiful, the ambient sections are some of the most well-textured and consistently investing material they'd had in that vein in years, and even all the pop hooks are excellent for what they are and really easily stick in the head. It's just so much fun to listen to, with every single second delivering something interesting, and I feel like I keep noticing stuff that I wouldn't notice before with each listen. Okay, I have listened to the album frequently enough at this point where there's not a lot more new insight that I can gather from it that I haven't in years previous. I mean, I've had this thing in regular listening rotation for like 8 years now. I've heard it so much that I've basically memorized how the whole thing goes and can like mouth along with all the random asides. But, I mean, I've never gotten sick of any of it, and I don't see myself getting sick of it anytime soon. It's just a giant all-time favorite, and I don't care what anyone says. Now, going through individual tracks, we of course have to start with the title track. The Dream, the Future Academy of Noise, Rhythm, and Gardening Mix, which is one of the best subtitles for anything ever. I will freely admit that for a long time I used to consider this to be a bit of a slow start to the album and often felt the urge to skip to the second track. Enough so where this project would end up being the prime example I would go to for an album suffering from what I called second track syndrome. You know, where the second track is the one you want to go to and then the first one just gets left by the wayside. But goddamn did I not give this opener enough credit for how much it kicks ass in its own right and really helps set the tone for the album. Just starting out with this absolutely immersive blend of guitars and synths and narrations about expiring contracts, creating a suitably dreamlike atmosphere that completely envelops you. And that's before the super thick bass line and heavily thumping beats come in to join it and really kick its groove into high gear. It's just such a freaking badass introduction to this album. Just all this instrumentation and the various samples swirling around create this effect that feels like I'm materializing in the middle of like an alien council meeting or something. And mind you, this is the track that I would frequently skip over. It was certainly never because I didn't like this intro. More because I would want to get straight to track 2 because I love that one so much. The title track is excellent and even more of a standout than it ever was in preparation for this video, but the album's lead single, Vuja Day, is in my top 5 favorite tracks the Orb ever made. Hell, it might even be top 3. It's right up there for me with Little Fluffy Clouds and Toxygen. I know I kinda sit alone with that particular take, but again, I don't care. Right from the very first time I heard it, the second Aki Amori's hook came in, "It's the way that you hold me." I was just absolutely in love. And the way they build up to it, too, from the echoing sound effects that sound like a crappy motorcycle revving up or something, to the slowly evolving beat that hits harder and harder the further you get into the track, to those sharp metallic synth chords, do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do, and then the train whistle before Amori comes in for that super satisfying payoff. Every single little aside and random voice snippet is super memorable and may as well work as catchy mini hooks in their own right. And that's also not accounting for that whole ending section where the entire mix basically just slowly melts into this warm and pleasant cloud of ambience. Now, again, I would totally get it if you just thought this track was kinda dumb or even cynical, especially with the zero-effort lyrics that are just the most basic, typical love song or sex song cliches you've ever heard. But this song isn't literally about the way someone's holding or kissing Aki Amori to me. Maybe it might be if she'd had the same kind of restrained delivery she did on Once More from Sidonia, but here she's way more forceful and in your face. Her delivery's really impassioned and excited sounding, but in a way that feels more like she's just another cool sounding instrument among all these other dense mixes of sound around her. If it's meant to be an expression of love, it comes off as an especially strange and alien one that has time to have some guys yelling, "What the hell is that? Let's get on with it." Which, as an aromantic person, is kind of a mood. But like I care about any kind of message or what's being said in the song itself, this track is so much more about the overall sense of environment being created. If the title track was like watching some kind of dream-like vision of an alien city slowly unfolding in front of me, Vuja Day is like being in that alien city fully formed. Complete with a full society, hundreds of people passing by doing their own thing as performed by all those various voice snippets, and with like a big Times Square-like screen that has the hot new single on the radio playing right now. It's just so cool to have so many sounds going on that have nothing to do with each other just blend so perfectly together and have such a kick-ass tune on top of it. I have nothing but the highest praises to sing for it. Now, of course, we got 13 more tracks to discuss, and all of them have pretty similar appeals to these first two, so I probably won't linger on them as long. There are a number of interludes sprinkled throughout the track listing, and while none of them would rank among my favorites, they do all add an extra bit of flavor to the album. A track like Something Supernatural just feels like a random news broadcast where all the anchors are having a mild existential crisis. But it bleeds right into A Beautiful Day, which is just as soaring and expansive as his title makes it out to be. Loads of Pink Floyd-style guitars, shimmering synth pads, radio announcers talking about how nice the weather is, and melting steel, and whether it would be permissible to maneuver a receptionist's donuts. Oh, and of course the airy and soulful harmonies from guest vocalist Juliet Roberts, who shows up on a few different tracks here. She always delivers really solid hooks that add that extra element of poppy catchiness, but always perfectly play into the overall sense of atmosphere that the whole album is trying to create. Now, on the topic of poppy tracks, we also gotta talk about the album's other single, DDD Dirty Disco Dub. And, okay, I will freely admit that this is the one track where I would most easily be able to understand if the cheesiness of this whole album got to be a bit much for you. A full chorus of Andy Kane harmonizing with himself and saying, "Halle, halle, halle, halle," or "Come on, yo, let's go, we gonna go to the disco," followed by voice snippets talking about left hands and right hands and hard panned to whichever side they're talking about. Like, I will admit, this track is pretty impossible to take seriously. I just feel like that was probably the whole point. Like, these guys know exactly how cheesy and uncool this all is and just don't give a fuck. And that, in combination with how strong the underlying grooves and bass lines are, can easily get the uncoolness of the track to come all the way back around into being pretty badass. Next up, we got The Truth Is, which is like the darker and more minor key companion to A Beautiful Day, oddly atmospheric and cinematic sounding mix of bubbly synths, jazzy trumpets and flutes, Juliet Roberts and some voice snippets reminding you to be yourself and hold on to your own identity, beatboxing, jingle bells, acoustic guitar strumming and tribal drumming, and maybe even a sample from like some old 50s movie soundtrack placed way in the background, maybe. A Beautiful Day may be a much more popular track among fans, but I feel like this track is almost equally as good. And after another interlude called Phantom of Ukraine, that sounds like a bunch of, like, sound scientists discussing the merits of a 3-note synth riff, which is 30 seconds, easily the least important track in the bunch, and I still remember everything that happens in it. But after that, we get into Mother Nature, an even darker and more sinister exploration of the mix explored on something like The Truth Is. Lots of thumping beats that have a sort of reggaeton-ish bounce to them, going up against layers of banjos and spy guitars and squelching synths and buzzing bass, with one more harmonized refrain from Juliet Roberts, "Mother Nature," and lots of constant filtered rapping from the Corporal, who is a way cooler presence than he was when he showed up on Bicycles and Tricycles. Also, this track might low-key be the catchiest one in the bunch. I have so frequently just had this one pop into my head and I just start mumbling to myself about how we're going back to Mother Nature. I don't really know what it means. I wouldn't be surprised if it's just about like smoking weed or something, but I don't really care either. It just kicks ass. Moving on from there, we get Lost and Found, one of the surprisingly more emotionally resonant cuts in the bunch. It's also probably the most straightforward dub reggae cut here as well. Lots of typical dub beats. I think even the same beat from Towers of Dub, but I didn't even notice that would be the case until like a few years ago. All the sonic hallmarks of, dub reggae material is here. The thick bass lines, plucky, syncopated guitar rhythms, also featuring occasional horn sections and some like movie soundtrack string pads. The latter's not really a dub thing necessarily, but And also with the Corporal leaning the hardest into his Jamaican accent, and he maybe like what sounds like blowing his nose a few times in the beginning. Because why not? The yelpy refrains of "You won't find it" are among the strongest hooks on the album as well, but it all creates a strangely nostalgic and bittersweet effect that turns all the dub reggae cliches into something that feels genuinely heartfelt. Another major favorite of mine on the album. Now, if you were hankering for something that doesn't lean as strongly into having lead vocals and pop hooks, don't worry, Lost and Found is the last track on the album with a strong pop hook like that, and everything afterwards starts moving into more free-flowing and abstract territory, without caring as much about catchiness. But that certainly doesn't mean we're getting any dip in quality. You got a mysteriously chilling interlude of mysterious flute sounds and an introductory announcer talking to a crowd of kids in the Forest of Lioness. And then we're led into Catskills, which is another particularly strange turn that seems to take a lot of Middle Eastern and Indian influences in its sound. Layers of flutes, maybe tabla drumming. There's some light sitars in there in between the giant buzzing synth bass. Also some woman yelping every few beats. A monologue from like a Bond villain with a weird fake accent. One instance of like a Hanna-Barbera car brake sound effect. There's no real tune or hook beyond maybe one creaky voiced sample saying, "Don't worry about it." All the various musical elements seem to be like in different keys, though none of them clash and still form that immersive sense of atmosphere. And that atmosphere is made a lot more alluring and beautiful in following cut, High Noon, which follows all the cartoon gun shootout sound effects in its intro with this expansive mix of immersive synth pads, melancholy guitar patterns from Steve Hillage evoking old Western movies, pianos, voice snippets from a nurse being hit on by her patient, various other percussion patterns and synth sequences that form more of a groove. I'd say this track even beats out something like A Beautiful Day in terms of how well developed and textured its overall atmosphere is, even if not by a whole lot, and that track had the benefit of having the Juliet Roberts hook, which I really like. If you were turned off by all the pop hooks on the first half of the album and decided to skip over the rest for whatever reason, at least make sure you've heard High Noon. It is one of the most gorgeous tracks in their repertoire. Anyway, we got one last interlude in Sleeping Tiger and the Gods Unknown, which fittingly does create a very mysterious but deeply emotional effect through its low-key mix of synth pads and violins, but it bleeds perfectly into the most mysterious-sounding cut of all, as well as the longest, the 8-minute psychedelic trip that is Codes, combining low-key percussion with echoing, airy, wordless vocal performances from Carol Luna, which are much more textural in approach than any of the other vocal guests on the album, maybe even bordering on operatic much later in the track, but never that intense or upfront. The track just keeps intensifying as its slow-plodding beat goes on, Steve Hillage's various layers of guitar solos melting into each other over increasingly thick bass lines and even some snippets that sound like choirs. There admittedly isn't an absolute ton of progression over its 8 minutes, but there's just enough to keep me interested, as would be the case in the usual long-winded orb epics. And it doesn't throw off the pacing either. The whole mix kind of reminds me of something that might show up on, like, Oblivion, but with a somewhat crisper and cleaner sound mix than most of the material on there. Also probably bassier. Very nice stuff, but then the album closes with its least melodic and most abstract and experimental cut of all, Orbisonia. Mostly just a mix of random sound effects and strange, moody synth bells and voice snippets talking about stereo audio experiences, before eventually just dropping into these super slow, tapping percussion textures that are just covered in so freaking much reverb, with everything else just still floating on top and meandering wherever the heck. It still creates a really strong atmosphere. There's like a bassy drone going through most of it that does create some sense of place to tie all the random noises together. And it still sounds really cool, easy to sink myself into, and just as densely layered and compelling as everything else on the album, despite the lack of structure. But I will admit it is a particularly strange note to finish on. Maybe even slightly anticlimactic after all the ridiculous and dense trips you've gone on throughout the project. I mean, I guess it works as an ending, especially given this album is called The Dream, and this might be the most dreamlike and strange of all of them. Like the moments right before you wake up, I suppose. But it's the kind of ending that, leaves me hungering for some more, like some kind of final encore to finish with more of a bang. Which is why I opted to keep around a version that includes one bonus track. Now, if you're American and you bought this album on iTunes, that bonus track would be their cover of Lynyrd Skynyrd's Freebird. Which, makes sense to end a relatively unserious album like this with the decades-old rock concert encore meme. And their much dubbier take on the song does fit relatively well into the mix of the album, but the version of the album I've kept on my iPod and gotten most accustomed to includes one different original track called Let the Music Set You Free, which also has the feeling of like a big final climactic encore and a return to the vocal pop leanings of the first half of the album. and honestly fits a lot more with the overall sound of the album than Freebird does. It does place its bubbly synths and thick bass lines and repetitive vocal hooks over some much more synthetic sounding drum machine disco beats, but the groove is still easily strong and catchy enough to carry over at 7 minutes, and you might not even notice the slightly less dub-centric texture of the percussion here to begin with, or the length. It's a great freaking track, and I would argue the most satisfying pick for an ending that you could have gone with. But yeah, that's everything on The Dream. Not a weak track in the bunch. Sure, there's definitely some that I hold closer to me than others, and I do think I'm a bit more drawn towards the poppier first half of the album than the hazier and more abstract ambient compositions that populate the back half. There have been some listens where this project kinda lost steam, like around Catskills, but I can just as easily see that whole stretch resonating even more with people who were maybe slightly more turned off by the poppier moments. And I still love that whole section too, obviously. This project is just such a unique and well-detailed experience that has me absolutely invested from start to finish, and I've listened to probably hundreds of times by now, and I've never gotten sick of. All the atmosphere is super immersive, all the grooves absolutely bang on a level that most others don't, all the pop hooks are excellent, super catchy and memorable and never annoying, and never feeling like a cynical label concession either. I feel like all the poppy elements are here specifically because that's just the kind of album that Dr. Alex specifically wanted to make. And even if the lyrics are dumb, everyone sounds like they really care. And the random disparate sense of humor, even if it doesn't exactly make me laugh, still it never fails to make me crack a smile. It really landed for me in such a way that fits with the whole dream theme, and like you're shifting through loads of completely alien worlds and bizarre societies that resemble our own but just happen to not make any sense. The whole album basically seems to operate on dream logic in that way. I legit considered giving this project the same score as Adventures Beyond the Ultraworld since it's that huge a part of my life. Though I will freely admit, I still prefer that one. The Dream feel like it may have fit a similar amount of substance in a smaller amount of time just from how dense it sounds, but I feel like Adventures Beyond the Ultraworld does a much better job of combining all of the Orb's strengths, and is a much more indicative look of what they're all about throughout their entire career. Also, I probably have a stronger emotional attachment to that one. Because of course. This album certainly embodies a certain kind of ethos and execution that no one but the Orb could ever come up with. It is very much a one-of-a-kind experience. But it is also still an outlier in their catalog, and they don't have any other albums that sound like this. Parts of No Sounds Are Out of Bounds and Abolition of the Royal Familia can come close, but they're not quite the same. I don't think this album would be the worst possible place to start for someone who's never listened to The Orb, but I feel like there's a flip of a coin on whether or not this album actually will connect with you like it did for me. And if it does, like if you end up getting really attached to this album like I did before hearing any of their other albums, it's gonna be that much more difficult to get into their other projects that go for a much more subtle approach. I fully understand that The Dream isn't everyone's cup of tea, and an album that revels this much in its silly, lighthearted cheesiness with all the house-style vocal appearances may be pretty big turnoffs for people. I know I'm in the minority of people who hold this album up on this high a level, but it's still a giant fixture in my life. It's one of my most listened to albums of all time, and I just love pretty much everything about it, so I'm overall feeling a strong 9.3 out of 10 on it. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters. They're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list or make me review something, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.